There are a million node tree videos on the internet, and if we're not careful, these can actually end up making our color grading worse. In this video, I'm going to talk you through how to avoid this, and then I'm going to show you the way I've set up my brand new template node graph to allow for quick, confident, and intuitive color grading that delivers beautiful results shot after shot. But before we dive into Resolve, start talking about nodes, node graphs, color grading, all that good stuff, I want to take just a second to talk about the true purpose of a template node graph, because I think this is something that many of us get wrong right off the bat. There's a kind of fuzzy concept floating around the color grading world that a template node graph exists to capture everything we might ever want to do in any shot for any project and have it all self-contained within our template node graph, because God forbid we have to press the button to add a node at any point, right? But this really misses the mark. This really doesn't represent the true purpose of a template node graph. Sure, we want to have the things we most commonly are going to reach for and want to introduce in terms of nodes represented in that template node graph so that we don't have to needlessly repeat the same operations shot after shot after shot. And yes, we definitely want our template node graph to be versatile in the sense that we'll work on lots of different projects, and so that we can use it on those different projects and get really familiar, get really comfortable with it, get really efficient at navigating that node graph. But none of these things represent the fundamental purpose of a template node graph. I'm going to suggest this to you. The fundamental purpose of a template node graph is not so much to organize the way you work inside of Resolve. It is to organize the way you think about the color grading process. So if we imagine a template node graph that has lots and lots of complexity, but manages to capture everything that we might ever want to do, that to me is not a win in a template node graph, because what's going to happen over time when you're using a template node graph with lots and lots of nodes and lots of fancy interconnections between those nodes is it is going to complicate your thinking about your process. It's going to be difficult to figure out where you should make a particular adjustment, whether you should go back to an old node or create a new node. It is going to feed into what I call in my book, The Colorist 10 Commandments, complexity inertia. We always want to be seeking simplicity when we're color grading. Template node trees are no exception. So there's this balance that we want to strike between having a template node tree that captures the stuff that we most repeatedly need to do when we're grading, while at the same time keeping it as lean and efficient as we can, because that is going to keep our thinking lean and efficient. So with that in mind, let's take a look here inside of Resolve, and we're going to go through my brand new template node graph, and I'm going to show you how I've applied that concept to this new template node graph and what I do within each and every node within the node graph. So what I'm going to do is go over here to my gallery, and I'm going to go to my power grades here for trees. And I've got two templates here that I'm going to point out here. The first is my base tree. This is the tree that I use every day in my professional practice. By the way, one of the main reasons I'm making this video today is because the template node tree that I'm currently using here on YouTube has kind of fallen out of step with what I'm doing professionally, and I want to give it a facelift here on the channel so that we can be as closely as possible mirroring what I'm actually doing in my professional practice as of today. So I've got these two trees. I've got the base tree. This is what I'm using in my professional practice. And then I've got the native tree that we're going to be going through here today. These two are almost identical. The only difference is that the base tree relies on some tools that I've developed for myself that allow me a bit more control over certain things in my grading process. This would be a fun video to do as a deep dive in and of itself, to take a look at those custom tools and kind of show you what they allow me to do that I can't do with Resolve's native tools. But for today, we're going to look at this native tree because it is the exact same structure as my base tree, and it relies on operations that any of us can perform right within Resolve's native tool set. So let's apply this thing to this shot here and see what we got. Here it is. Now, those of you who've been here on the channel for a little bit are going to recognize this is actually on paper a more complex node graph than my prior iteration of my node graph. There's a few more nodes in here, and there's a few more sort of non-standard, non-serial structures to navigate within it, okay? But my goal here was really to introduce some things that I found myself constantly wanting to add into my process, and to end up with a template node graph that I still use most of, and that allows me to save some keystrokes or some control surface strokes in terms of adding nodes that I am consistently needing to use in my process. We're going to go through every single one of these nodes and how I'm using each and the way that each is set up, less because I want to sell you on this being the perfect template node tree, even though for me today it is, and more because I want to show you what it looks like to set up your perfect template node tree and all the things that you want to be thinking about when you go to do so. Before we dive in, I want to point out one very important thing about the way that my nodes are set up and numbered here. I want to go to my resolve preferences for a moment, and we're going to go to color and then user up here, and look at this box that I have checked. Preserve node numbers when adding nodes. This is important because I'm a big fan of using the previous and next node feature on my control surface. And what this allows me to do is to have a different sequence for my process, what I like to do first, second, third, and last, versus the sequence in terms of order of operations that is applied for these images. So I can apply operations to the image in a different order than I make my adjustments within the node graph. If that doesn't make sense, sit tight. You're going to make more sense of it in just a second here. But let's dive in and let's start by talking about my prime node. So this prime, balance, and sat node, this first trio here, these really represent the core of the grading work that I'm going to do on any given shot. If I can't get the image on its feet and looking good here, it's never going to get better going over here. At least it's not ever going to get to a good point if I am relying on things after that point to get to a good looking image. So this is really the heartbeat of the template node tree. This is the section of the template node tree that was represented in my prior version of my template node graph. So maybe no big surprise there as to how important these first three things are. But let's talk about this primary node and the way that I'm going to work through it here. So within Resolve's native toolset, since I'm not using the custom version of this node tree that I referenced a moment ago, here's what I'm going to do. First things first, as always, I'm going to set my exposure. I like to do that with my HDR global because when I'm just using the wheel, not the trackball, this is identical to using linear gain. And what's fun and a bit of an improvement from using linear gain, meaning setting my gamma here to linear, which we're going to see in just a moment, what's fun about not having to do that is I can still set my exposure in that linear gain fashion. But once I've set my exposure, I can go over to my primaries and I can grade in log, which is my preference. So for this shot, I might like open up my shadows a little bit, drop my gamma down, bring my gain up, just kind of try to finesse the tonality of this image a little bit more, even beyond just what I'm getting out of my exposure adjustment. So something like that's starting to feel pretty good to me. I'm getting a little bit more kind of thickness in the image, but I can still see everything really well and it's feeling really good. And funny enough, this is a shot that is a good example of one where the balance is far enough out that it's almost distracting from my ability to make really finessed decisions with my prime node here. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, and instead I'm going to press forward to adjusting my balance. Even though I typically like to start with prime and with my tonal adjustments, that's what this node is for doing exposure and contrast, all tonal work for the image. I like to start there because generally speaking, that's going to be more critical to the eye. That's going to have more impact on the end viewer. So I like to prioritize that first and then move on to my balance. But in this case, the balance is also going to play a big role because I really want to swing it around and make a big change with it. And herein is the first point where that preserve node numbers option that we just looked at in our resolve preferences is going to come into play here. So you'll notice in terms of order of my nodes from left to right, my balance actually hits first, but numerically it is numbered higher. That means that when I load in this template node graph, I'm going to be starting on node 1 here because that's where I saved the template node graph to be selected when I load that node graph in. And when I hit my favorite button, next node, I'm now going to be working my balance, even though my balance is happening in order of operations prior to the prime node. Now, why is that important? Why do I care about that? Why am I doing that? This is a new change in this new version of my template node graph that really reflects an observation that I've made that by the time I've made these adjustments, if I have my balance node downstream and I linearize that image for the duration of that node, which by the way is what we're doing here in node number 2, I've right-clicked and I've already set my gamma to linear. That's already saved right into the template node graph, so I don't have to manually do that. But if I do this in between node 1 and 3, as opposed to before node 1, I am not going to be getting a true scene linear image. So I like this to be, in terms of processing order, prioritized and done prior to the left of my prime node, even though for my process as a colorist, for my priorities as a colorist, I still like to start with that prime node, okay? So here in my balance node, I've already got my gamma set to linear, and with my gamma set to linear, I like to just work my gain. This is a very clean, very simple way of altering the ratio of red to green and blue in the domain of real and physical light. And you can see this is getting to a nice place really quickly. So I'm just going to kind of nudge this around. And what I'm looking for are really three things when I'm making a balance adjustment. I'm looking at maybe getting a traditional sense of like neutrality, or like what we would call white balance, like in sort of a technical sense. But more importantly, I'm looking at two other things. I'm looking at skin tone, making sure that I'm making skin look just as good or preferably better than it did before I made my balancing adjustment. And I'm looking at color separation. I really want to max out my color separation using my balance. A really good rule of thumb when you're color grading: color separation is very easy to diminish. It's harder to create. It's harder to get. So in my first pass of grading through a shot, for the most part, in most cases, I'm really trying to max out that separation, because I know I can always take it down later, but getting it can be tricky. So I want to front load that as much as possible, get as much separation as I can, and then know that it'll be very easy to pull back on that a click if that's what I decide I want to do. So here's my balancing node thus far: before, after. That's a big shift. That's looking really good, right? So that's node number one, and now node number two with my balance set to linear. Let's go next, or with my gamma set to linear, I should say. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to go next node again. And you can now see, because I've got my node numbering preserved, I'm going to the next numerical node in my node tree, which is my SAT node. Now, my SAT node is something that there's been a lot of questions about here on the channel lately, because we've been talking about Color Slice lately, the new tool that was released with Resolve 19, which, among other things, has a very good saturation model that I'm a big fan of. So the question has come up like, oh, in your template node tree, are you using Color Slice instead of the SAT node that was in your previous generation or iteration of your template node tree? I am not. I'm still using that same setup that I've used previously, which is to set my color space to HSV, and then turn channels 1 and 3 off, leaving only channel 2, which is the S of HSV, or saturation. Here's why I'm doing this. Color Slice has a slightly better model, it's true, than HSV. I like it a little bit better. It's not a world of difference, by the way, but it is slightly better. And Color Slice allows me more control over the saturation for particular hues, for say our cyans, for example, which we're going to look at in just a second here. But what it doesn't do is allow me to shape my saturation curve with the same degree of control that I have doing things here in this HSV node that I've just created. So my go-to here, once I'm in this node, is just to use a combination of gamma and gain to kind of get a saturation level that feels really good. Gamma, once I'm in this setup, is essentially going to target the medium and lower saturations in the image and boost those up if I turn it to the right. And then gain is something that I can counter with, or even just leave alone. And that's going to be the saturation of my stuff that's already very saturated. So between these two, I can very easily control a simple saturation curve. Or if I feel like it's merited, I can even go over here to my custom curves and do a full-on shaped saturation curve if I really want to finesse something for a particular shot. It's not usually necessary, especially if I'm working under a good look. By the way, before I go any further forward, I'm working color manage today, as I always do. We've already touched on like 2 or 3 things that are dependent on color management being full and properly set up. So if you don't have that set up, you're going to run into problems. We've got lots of great videos here on the channel for how to set up your color management. So I'm not going to spend much time on that today. Just mention that we are operating within a color managed environment. Part of that color managed environment, if I look here at my timeline level, I've got my output transform, which is a Resolve color space transform here. And then upstream of it, in node number 1 here, I have a custom look that I've built using my look development plugin Contour. So I'm grading underneath both of these pieces, all right? But what I was saying here back at the clip level is oftentimes if we are under a good look, which itself has a good saturation curve, we may not need to do much more than simply work our gamma and gain of this HSV node to get our saturations feeling really, really good. And I definitely feel like that's the case here. This is looking really nice to me, okay? Okay, next up here, let's talk about these 2 sets of parallel mixers that I have here. So first things first, these are parallel mixers, not layer mixers. What's the difference between those two? The difference between those two is with a layer mixer, the bottommost layer always takes priority. So whatever is on the bottom, unless I'm using a non-standard composite mode or I've scaled back on my key output gain, unless I'm doing one of those things, the bottom is always going to be take higher priority over whatever is underneath it layer wise. Everything's kind of upside down in Resolve. So like if you're coming from an After Effects or a Photoshop background, bottom is top, if that makes sense. So node number 9 is highest visual priority. Node number 7 is lowest visual priority. That's with a layer mixer. With a parallel mixer, which is what I have here, each operation that I perform in each node of this parallel mixer has equal weight, with no priority being given to nodes based on where they're located in terms of their vertical position or their connection into the parallel mixer node here, okay? And this is actually a really handy thing for making secondary adjustments, especially ones that are going to rely on things like qualification or even just masks that are being produced based on the hue of the incoming image or the luminance or whatever it might be. It can be really beneficial for any and all of those secondaries to feed from one common state of image and not to be strung together back to back, and as a result subject to one key breaking because we changed the adjustment that we made to our image in a node prior to that. So this is an instance where it makes good sense to use parallel nodes as opposed to a serial node, okay? But this is another point where my node numbering and my order from left to right, my sequence from left to right, are differing. So check this out. If I go back to my saturation node here, and then I hit my favorite button again for next node, I don't get taken over to this parallel node structure. I get taken over to this parallel node structure. So again, both of these are parallel, and they're parallel for a reason, because they are operations that I want to stack up and have all pull from one common state of image, and then have them all be applied at equal strength regardless of their vertical position here. But nodes 4 and 6 here, which I have as placeholders, this whole parallel stack, as a matter of fact, is dedicated to power windows, because that's what I'm going to want to do very next after I set my primaries here. If you put me on a desert island, you are literally looking at the order of things that I would want to have the ability to adjust in order. Number 1 is always going to be my primary tonal stuff. Number 2, I would want to be able to balance. And as we're looking at this, I think I'm going to nudge this away from yellow, maybe just a little bit, like so. Number 3 would be saturation. Number 4 and beyond would absolutely be power windows that allow me to shape the image and guide the eye where I want it to go, okay? So that's what's going to happen here. And I've gone ahead and saved just some general window shapes here that are nice and soft, nice and big, and are really easy for me to modify for whatever I want to do. So in the case of this shot, maybe I would just want to do a real loose, soft shape around my subject. I already have these pre-inverted because this is often what I'm trying to do with my power windows, is do things on the outside. If not, I can always flip that back and uninvert it. But in this case, that's doing exactly what I want to do. And all I want to do here with this power window is knock down the world a little bit. I feel like that background is making it a little bit harder for me to kind of like look into my subject, and it's a little bit distracting. There are different things that I could use to bring that world kind of more into the background and to knock it down. Depending on what I'm trying to do, I might use my HDR exposure, as we did in our prime node. I might use my gamma in my primaries. That's maybe the most common thing that I will reach for. In this case, because these are pretty bright things back there that I'm wanting to tame, I'm going to reach for my gain. And I'm just going to pull these things in like so, off and then on. That feels really nice, right? And this to me is a great example of something that happens all the time that a template node tree really helps with. As soon as I make that adjustment, I'm like, well, overall, we could come up on our exposure a little bit. All I'm going to do is go back to node number 1, my primary node. That's always going to be where my base exposure lives. And I'm going to go back to my HDR and just open things up a little bit, like so. Okay? So node number 4, this power window, off and then on. That's all I really want to do with my power windows here. If I had more that I wanted to do, I would go forward into node number 6. And if I wanted to go forward from there, I would add additional parallel nodes within this stack as necessary for all of my windowing work. So again, all power windows are going to happen here in this stack. All right. In this case, we're in good shape with our power windows, and we can go forward to the next thing in terms of my order of priority for my process, which happens in order of processing before these power windows. So if I hit next node, I'm going to go back over to this first parallel node structure. Now, what's this parallel node structure for? What is its purpose? This parallel node structure is sort of a category of exclusion. This is for stuff that is not a primary, which I'm considering to be a prime, balance, and sat, and it is for stuff that is not a power window. Anything else is going to go into this parallel node stack. We could loosely call that our color secondaries. There's only one exception to that, which we're going to talk about in just a moment when we look at the overall end of the node graph, the last 2 nodes, all right? But for now, this is my catch-all for everything else. This is my color secondaries. This is where I might, for example, look at my color slice tool, which we talked about a moment ago. And if I go to my cyan saturation, I might want to get a little bit more sat out of like this shirt that is in my foreground, okay? So off, on. I'm gonna push that even a little bit further. There's kind of a balance to strike here. Like I'm getting some really nice separation and additional kind of feeling of colorfulness out of this, but I don't wanna go too far because it's starting to create a little bit of chatter in the image. So I'm gonna find like a sensible level for that, maybe like around a 1.5. And this is a great example of what I love to use the color slice tool for, is to adjust either saturation or hue or density at a particular hue, as opposed to the way I'm using my sat node over here, which is to shape my overall saturation across all hues, okay? So that's what I might do here. But anything else is fair play too. If I wanted to pull a qualifier, I would do it here. If I wanted to do like a hue versus hue rotation, I would do it here. Any kind of color secondary work that is not a power window would happen here in this parallel node structure. And as I mentioned here with my Windows parallel node structure, I would simply add parallel nodes as needed to this stack to build things out. Both of these are examples of that compromise between being very comprehensive and having everything that I feel like I need, but not giving myself a template node graph of like 40 nodes, which I'm sure, like me, you guys see out there all the time and you see people working within, and that seems a little bit like madness to me. So I've got a framework, a structure, a method of operation with this template node graph that I can easily expand on. It's not that I'm allergic to adding more nodes. I should feel very free and very capable of adding more nodes in the right place with the right purpose, and also maintaining my overall organizational structure that is provided by my template node graph, okay? So if I go off and then on here, that's my little cyan bump. Love what that's doing in the image. You can see in the vector scope, that's really kind of stretching out that color contrast and making the image feel more colorful. Okay, let's turn off my effects over here and take a look at the tail of the node graph. So once again, I'm gonna go forward through my two nodes here, and we're gonna go to node number 10. Node number 10 doesn't have a label, seems to just be sitting there blank and empty. What the heck is the purpose of node number 10? Node number 10 is a special node with one particular purpose. Node number 10 is for doing anything textural that I might want to do with the image. There's a number of things that are going to fall into that category. This could be film grain. This could be halation. This could be mid-tone detail. This could be blurring. This could be texture popping. Anything that is about the relationship of pixels spatially to one another. Now, why am I doing that here? Why not just incorporate any such adjustments into my catch-all color secondaries stack over here? There's good reason for it, and it's because the parallel node structure that is very, very helpful for the reasons that we already discussed here in this video, it is not conducive or friendly to textural adjustments like this. We've covered this in other videos, but essentially you're going to be prone to getting ringing and weird visual artifacts when you attempt to do spatial things within a parallel node structure. So anytime you're using a parallel node structure, this is a really good rule of thumb, you don't want to do anything textural. I'll make that distinction. Spatial is okay if you're talking about power windows, which are spatial in terms of limiting things by geometry. I'm talking about texture, where the operation is about the behavior of a pixel and the pixels around it and the way that they integrate and interact. That's something you never want to do inside of a parallel node structure. It's not something I necessarily do a ton of at the shot level, and it's not something that I want inhabiting a bunch of empty real estate in my node graph, but it's something that I do enough that I want to have a dedicated place for it that I can go to at any time I want to do that. And in the case of this shot, there actually is something that I want to do. I referenced a moment ago when we were adding some cyan saturation to our image that I'm starting to see a little bit of noise here. Now, this may challenge the YouTube stream, so if you're not seeing much of a difference, then my apologies for the low quality of what we're looking at here, but hopefully the idea will travel regardless. So here's what I want to do. I just want to apply some noise reduction to clean up what's going on here in this shoulder. And for the sake of example, let's even boost up what we're doing in the color slice to kind of exaggerate. So I've got a little bit more noise going on here that's being created by really pushing the color slice too hard, but you can take my word for it that even if you weren't seeing it before, this bit of chatter that is starting to emerge was still there, and it might be something I would want to address even if it's less visually obvious than we're now looking at. So let's go back to node number 10 here. And what we're going to do is just go to our noise reducer. I like to use spatial over temporal. Temporal is another thing that can cause artifacts, so we're going to stick with spatial. I'm going to stick with spatial, generally speaking. I'm going to set my mode to better. I like better more than enhanced and ultra NR. It's been around for longer than those two, but I just feel like it produces more organic results for my eye. I'm going to set the radius to medium. Generally, you want to set this as low as you can go. If small gets the job done, then that's going to be better. But in this case, I'm going to need a little bit larger of a radius. And I'm just going to slam this until I've really done away with all that noise that I'm seeing in the shirt that's in foreground frame left. So we've got our before and our after. Before, after. So you can hopefully see that change. If not, you can take my word for it that there is a change there. I'm cleaning up the noise. And what you might be seeing even more readily than the change on this dude's shoulder here is the change in the texture of my subject's face. This is that classic sort of like plasticky thing that comes with noise reduction that makes me want to avoid noise reduction at all costs and do as little of it as possible, as late as possible in my color grading process. But in this case, I want to find a way to get what I want without the things that I don't want. And one way that I might go about that, I could limit this spatially. I could use a power window if I wanted to. In this case, I've got a really easy color basis that I can separate these things on. So I'm going to go to my qualifier, and I'm going to go into my highlight mode here, and I'm just going to use hue to narrow my selection arbitrarily to a pretty small width. And then I'm just going to sweep until I've got as much of that shirt in there as possible and as little of everything else as possible. So something like that. We're going to go nice and soft with our hue soft. Again, just kind of like sweep that width, see how narrow I can go, sweeten that center, something like that. And what I might try here as well is in my saturation, I'm just going to grab my sat low clip and see if I can't just come in a little bit on that and get some of what I'm seeing over frame right out of the deal, like so. And again, I'm just going to kind of keep sweeping and try to get the cleanest key that I can for this image. That's not bad there. Let's make sure I've got a little bit of softness in that sat low clip. Let's also addition how much that saturation is really doing for me. Okay, it's doing enough that I'll take it. And what we can do now is turn everything off and take a look at the adjustment. So that's off and that's on. That's still doing its job on the shirt in foreground and frame left here, but it is no longer whacking my subject's face or the rest of that frame with that odd feeling plasticky texture. Okay, so that's one example of many of things that I might do here at this point. Again, this might also be film grain, halation, texture popping, mid-tone detail, blur, any type of textural operation that I might want to apply to the image. That needs to happen here. And if you need more textural operations, I would do these in serial at this point in the node tree. Okay. Okay, last but definitely not least, let's talk about this trim node that I have here. So this trim node is kind of an oddball. It's an unusual one in that I'm actually trying not to use it for as long as I possibly can. This trim node has one specific job to play for me in my color grading process. As we get right up close to the end of a color grading process, when we're making those final little tweaks and tunes and adjustments, there's often those moments where we're like, oh, let's just pull back on our exposure just a little bit, or let's add just a little bit more weight to the frame in terms of tonality, whatever it might be. And it's something that at that point, I almost want the opportunity to grade the graded image, if that makes sense. Normally, if I were looking to do some of the things that I just listed, I would go back over to my prime node and adjust those things right here. Just like we did in our example where when we introduced our power window in node number 4, and turned it on, and I said, oh, exposure can afford to come up now. I just bounced back over to my primary node, and I made that adjustment right here. That's a big conceit of my color grading process and the way that I use template node graphs. I am trying to finesse the existing node structure and the existing nodes within that structure before I add new stuff. So I'm not just spinning up new nodes every single time I want to make an adjustment. If I need the ability to compare where I just was, I will use either the undo and redo buttons on my control surface, or I'll simply grab a still of the previous state of the image and use that as a reference that I can look back at before I make my adjustment and then say, okay, here's before, here's after, that type of thing. So I'm always trying to work my way within my existing node structure, but this trim node is sort of like a intentional deviation a little bit from that process in the sense that it's a node I'm trying to leave unadjusted with no manipulations within it, just so that right at the very end of the process, if I'm looking at the image and I'm like, gosh, I just think we could use a little bit of this. It's a place where I can A/B the adjustment really, really easily, and it's a place where I can make that adjustment and essentially grade the graded image, as I said. So that's the extent of it. That's my template node graph. And like I said, more than trying to sell you on this being the perfect template node graph for all of us, for all situations, I want to walk you through how I was able to develop my perfect template node graph for my purposes as of my making this video today. This is something that's constantly in evolution, but I'm always thinking about it and evolving it along the lines of the considerations that we've talked through here today, trying to have it be comprehensive, include everything that I want, while also being lean and efficient, because I know that that's going to influence my color grading choices in a positive direction. And really, if we think about what I just did as, like, let's null out our trim node that we just adjusted here. And let's think about everything that we've just done essentially as like a first pass. So we've got our before and our after, right? Off, on. That's a really solid first pass, right? This image looks way better than it did before. I have a really firm grasp on each of the ingredients that went into this dish as it stands right now. And as I'm going further into the color grading process, into refining, into addressing notes with my clients, I have a very lucid notion of where everything is happening, what all is happening. And if I have an itch that I want to scratch, or if I have feedback from my client, I know exactly where to go to adjust my image and get where we're trying to go and make the adjustment. And I don't have that sense that so often can accompany you, whether you are grading kind of freehand with no template node graph, or whether you have a template node graph that you feel like just isn't capturing everything that you need to, or isn't properly organizing your process. You get this feeling of like, I don't know, just add another serial node at the end because I don't know what else to do. And we're just going to keep on stacking things at the end of that template node graph. This template node tree for me is the closest I've ever come to giving me a stable structure that I can operate within. So even when I'm adding nodes, I'm adding them intentionally at a particular point in the process that allows me to easily navigate, and that allows me to easily go previous node, next node, or here on my advanced panel to actually call up nodes by number and to easily make an adjustment. Like if my client says, hey, we're feeling a little greenish, or we're feeling a little pinkish, for example, I already know that that adjustment is going to be made in node number 2. I'm going to key in node number 2, and I'm just going to make that adjustment right here. And again, I can do like an undo and a redo to audition that change for my client. So I hope you enjoyed this walkthrough of my new template node tree. I hope this gives you lots of food for thought for how to develop your own template node tree and how to think about your node tree, and allows you to focus on, again, what I see as the number one most important consideration in a template node tree, which is not how it organizes like your hands and your eyes and your work inside of Resolve so much as how it organizes the way you think about color grading. If you can change the way you think about color grading, if you can become more efficient and less complex in the way you think about color grading, that is the easiest, fastest way that I know of to improve your color grading. So hopefully this is helpful along those lines, and hopefully gives you a little bit of orientation into the node graph that I'm going to be using here on the channel going forward.